The accusations were thrown at me liberally after that moment by multiple members of staff and volunteers, often in casual remarks made where our paths crossed, veiled as jokey banter. I was repeatedly accused of lying, of alcoholism, of drug addiction, of mental illness and violent anger. Any time I clarified I was neither an alcoholic nor a drug addict, I was told I was in denial. It was part of my sickness. My caseworker would pointedly not meet without a witness because she feared I would attack her. Often during our sessions, she would announce I was scaring her and leave. I was starting to experience minor anxiety attacks on a regular basis, so started spending as little time as possible there. I felt fine when I was off the premises. I would wake in the morning and take my laptop to a coffee shop, not returning until the curfew at night. Even that was used against me. I was told I had antisocial tendencies, I was refusing to engage, and it was part of the mental health issues I denied having. I was accused of lying about my whereabouts because they had checked the local coffee shop and I hadn't been seen there. Of course I hadn't. It wasn't the coffee shop I frequented. I invited them to speak to the managers of the shop where I had become a regular client and she could confirm my presence. There was no response. It was one of my few victories. It was small, but I took it. Childishly I stuck out my tongue. I was repeatedly phoned by staff and volunteers to ask my whereabouts. I was often told to return to attend a meeting, only to have that meeting cancelled after my arrival because something else had come up, or told I was confused, that no meeting had been requested, or had been arranged for another day. I eventually had to turn my phone off because it was sparking anxiety every time it rang. That led to further accusations of antisocial tendencies and paranoia. One morning I left my room and returned later in the day to discover I had lost my keys. I informed the person at the desk, who called one of the members of staff. When he arrived, he announced he wasn't surprised, it was common with people like me. He then asked,
"Were you angry? You know what you're like when you're angry. Did you throw them at somebody?"
He then laughed and tossed a couple of quick boxer jabs into the air. I couldn't enter my room because they were, unsurprisingly, too busy to deal with the problem at the time. I would have to wait. I took the time to retrace my steps, even rummaging through a rubbish bin because I remembered throwing out some facial tissue and considered the possibility I had inadvertently dropped my keys in with it. I asked the manageress of the coffee shop, who conducted a thorough search of the store with no luck. I returned to Passage House hours later and told them how thoroughly I had looked. I was genuinely apologetic as I knew it would require them to change the lock on my door. I was told my answer sounded too prepared, accused of lying again, and asked if I was really being honest about losing the keys. I started trembling and the drug accusation was thrown at me again. I was told to wait in the lobby. I asked if I could wait outside and told no, they would only be a few minutes. Over an hour later one of the caseworkers returned, the same one who had teased me about my violent anger earlier in the day, and handed me my keys. He said I was lucky he had been able to find them, but I wouldn't have lost them in the first place if it wasn't for my anger. I asked where they had been located and told that wasn't important. I was instead chastised that my first response hadn't been to thank him. I had to learn to be more grateful to people who were trying to help me. I found out that evening I had simply left them hanging in the lock on my door. One of the other residents on the floor noticed immediately and had come running down after me to return them before I left the building. He had been stopped by the same caseworker who had later told me how lucky I was he had found them. The whole afternoon was nothing more than another theatrical performance staged for my benefit. Another evening I returned and headed straight for the public toilet on my floor, desperate for a bowel movement. As I rushed through the lobby, I heard the worker on the desk phone someone and say,
"He's back."
While on the toilet, two caseworkers started banging on the door telling me to open up and forcing me to finish halfway through the movement. They were worried because I looked like I was tripping. They expressed relief I was fine, then asked if I wanted to discuss my problems with them. More theatrics for the paperwork. The issue of housing returned with a vengeance. My caseworker had located a flat in Plumstead, in Kent. Like a broken record, I repeated I could return to my previous residence when I was working and could pay the rent. And I had two potential sources of revenue lined up if they would only allow me to pursue them. I was provided the same roundabout arguments and told it was impossible to find housing without their help. When I pointed out I had done just that within 2 weeks of arriving in London, I scored another small victory. There was no response, just a blank stare. I was finally starting to put a few cracks in their facades and enjoyed the feeling immensely. My countering smirk probably should not have been so cocky and smug. I was then informed I did not meet any of the conditions to be housed in London. This argument had come up before and I had never been provided with the criteria despite asking. I held firm, arguing there may be a requirement they were not aware I met and started listing some potential factors. I had been born there. No, I was living there at the time I became homeless. No, I had technically obtained employment there, employment they were preventing me from accepting. No, and they weren't preventing me from looking for work. I had registered for a course at the City of Westminster College. No, I asked if my family's history could be a factor. John Kirk had received a knighthood for his philanthropic work in London, and my grandfather had earned an OBE for his work with the British Foreign Office and the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. No, they were dead. I had to have living family members in the city if I wanted to be housed there. That little nugget of information presented me with a slight moral dilemma. I have an older half-sister. Our mother had found herself in the family way as a teenager, sent to live with an aunt, and forced to give her firstborn child up for adoption. Sadly, they never reunited. My sister was unable to make contact until a few short months after our shared mother passed away. Mere months. Less than half a year. It was devastating, however my father's family picked up the pieces admirably and provided the welcome our mother's family had denied her for decades. You can't choose your family, but when it comes to picking up the pieces, some are better than others. My sister and I had connected when I arrived in London and made plans to get together once I was firmly on my feet. My subsequent dereliction obviously put a slight dent in those arrangements. She was unable to provide much in the way of assistance as she had pursued a career in the theater as an actress and in various behind-the-scenes roles. It is an exciting path, fraught with financial instability. She had navigated the route successfully for decades but was still just getting by. She had neither space nor resources to help her wayward brother. I hesitated to mention any of it. I had already regretted telling them of my mother's alcoholism as it had had no bearing on my homelessness despite both charities' fixated assertions to the contrary. It wasn't the root cause that charity think tanks love to chant to the media. I was a victim of my own stubbornness more than anything else, an inherited trait to be true, but one my parents had applied more successfully to their lives than I had to mine. They were in no way responsible for my current predicament, the responsibility was mine, and mine alone, something I had willingly acknowledged from the moment I first landed on the streets. And I was embittered to the interference with my existing family. Relations between my father and I had become understandably strained during this ordeal. During the initial sign-in procedures at both the Connection and Passage House, I had requested he not be contacted, and the relevant box had been ticked. Yet staff at both organizations had made occasional references to conversations held with him. When I asked why they had gone against my wishes, I was informed the agreement I signed gave them the right to discuss my case with anyone they felt was pertinent, in other words, anyone. Nice loophole. When I confronted my father, he at first denied, then admitted to one conversation with my caseworker, before asking why I insisted on fighting with them when they were only trying to help. Rightly or wrongly, he lost my trust, and I broke off contact with him for months. I did not particularly want to add my mother's ancient dirty laundry into the mix, particularly as she was 15 years dead and unable to speak for herself. But I was growing increasingly desperate. I needed a lifeline. I wrestled with the integrity behind putting self-interest over family for a few moments, and came up short. I threw my dead mother under the figurative bus and revealed all. For not. I was immediately admonished for not telling them earlier. This was necessary information for my file. I had to tell them everything. Why had I withheld this? What else was I withholding? This was the cause of my mother's alcoholism and the cause of all my problems. They asked for my sister's contact details so they could reach out to her and offer any support. She might need help. Had I not thought of that? I refused that request point blank, long having reached the mindset of not wishing charity assistance on my worst enemy, let alone a family member. I asked again if that met the requirement to be housed in London, my only reason for bringing it up. No. She was only a half-sister. That wasn't a strong enough connection. Unsurprisingly, that later proved to be another blatant lie. Though I had not wanted to sign on for job seekers' allowance, it did have a benefit I hadn't taken into consideration at the time. I had to meet with caseworkers at the Department of Works and Pensions once every 3 weeks. We had only met a handful of times, but in those few meetings we developed enough of a relationship I felt comfortable enough to start asking questions. It wasn't long before I found myself wishing I had turned to the various government departments relating to my situation instead of the charities when I first found myself lost in the streets of London. The system is not as complicated as I had been led to believe, and the staff not as uncaring as they had been painted. The charities, if anything, are an unnecessary middleman. I soon learned about many of the half-truths and misrepresentations I had been led to believe. They were also far more understanding of my need to find work quickly, and unsurprised by the charity's resistance to it. I had already attended a few work fairs throughout London and had been signed onto a work assistance program specializing in people over 50 conducted in partnership with Reed's recruitment agency in Willesden, North London. They in turn registered me for a 16-week internship with Lloyds Bank. I had also registered for a public speaking course through the University of Westminster College. These activities combined with the opportunities presented by Metro and the casting connection were all based in the north of London. The flat I was being offered was in Kent, far south of the capital. I was concerned about the length and cost of the commute. These opportunities combined with the existence of a half-sister also met the requirements to be housed in London. I also discovered the government were willing to negotiate with my former landlord despite the repeated assertions from both charities they would not. I was advised to look at the Plumstead flat and decline it to buy myself time. I had the right to turn down 2 opportunities, and this was only the first presented by Passage House. The law was on my side. On Monday, September 17, 2018, I viewed the flat. In all fairness, it had been renovated and was the cleanest I had yet seen. It was remote, there was no place locally where I could acquire regular internet access, and the commute from Kent to North London would have been too lengthy and too costly to afford as there was no local bus or tube service to London. But I was tempted to accept it. I was desperate to leave Passage House, my nerves were rapidly deteriorating. The mere sight of some staff members was enough to instigate a minor anxiety attack. Although I had been advised I could reject it outright, I did want to give it some serious thought before making a decision. The leasing agent was amenable and simply asked for a decision before the end of the week. My caseworker was not. I explained I was considering it but wanted a couple of days to think it over and gave her my reasons. She told me that wasn't allowed. I had to accept now, or I could not stay in the shelter anymore. I told her I had spoken to staff at the Department of Works and Pensions and they had told me they were valid reasons and by law I had the right to turn it down. I also told her they were willing to cover the rent at my previous residence despite my repeatedly being told they wouldn't. Her response was frightening.
The law doesn't matter. That's our policy.
She shouted I was the one that had broken the law by speaking to them in the first place. I had breached the confidentiality agreement I had signed in the contract, and I had violated data protection laws. I was now facing serious charges. She again informed me nobody would believe me. I was a liar, and she was going to make sure everybody knew I was a liar. She then screamed at me to get out. I ran. I returned that night and was surprised to be allowed back in. At that point I concluded she was bluffing and decided to call her on it. When I returned the next night, Tuesday, September 18th, there was a letter on my bed claiming my reason for rejecting the flat was invalid and if I didn't accept by Thursday, September 20th, I would be banned from Passage House for 24 hours and would have to accept the flat or I would not be allowed to return. I held firm. When I returned Wednesday, September 19th, I was denied entry. I argued their own letter stated the ban wouldn't be put into effect until the next night and was told it didn't matter. I asked if I could grab my sleeping bag and a sweater. No, it was part of the ban. I had also been allowing my partner in crime to store his sleeping bag and possessions in my room during the day and asked if I could retrieve them. Again no. Suffice to say, he was not pleased. We returned 10 minutes later and were denied entry. We stood on the front step for a few moments until one of the other residents left the building, politely holding the door open for us. All hell broke loose. We burst into the front lobby and he told me to get our stuff. I raced up the 4 flights of stairs to my room to the sound of shouts and yells from below. One of the staff chased after me shouting at me to stop or they would call the police. I entered my room and only had the opportunity to grab my mate's possessions that were lying within easy reach on my bed before my pursuer caught up with me screaming at me to get out. They were calling the police. I was petrified. I was escorted downstairs and we were both escorted out of the building. We didn't even make it to the end of the road before we burst out laughing. It had been frightening, but it had been strangely fun. I returned the next morning and was again denied entry because my caseworker was not on duty. I would have to wait until she started her shift. I asked when that was and told they couldn't tell me. I asked if she was even working that day and again told I could not be given that information. I asked if I could just change clothes and grab a couple of possessions, particularly my laptop, and told I was too great a security risk. I wandered the streets for hours, returned in the afternoon, denied entry again, and wandered a few hours more. When I returned that evening, I was exhausted, hungry, and willing to agree to anything. I rang the bell and after a few minutes my caseworker opened the door a crack. She asked if I was on drugs. I answered no. I asked if I could please come in. She said no, I had made my choice. I asked if I could grab some of my possessions. No. I asked if someone could gather a few things for me, willing to allow them entry to my room. No. I burst into tears and started begging, repeating please and I'm sorry in increasingly breathless gulps. She said she would think about it and closed the door. I sat on the steps sniveling, weeping, the phlegm pouring from my nose, mixing with my tears, and running down my face, into my mouth, and onto my clothes. I didn't even have a tissue to wipe it away. I used my sleeves and my hands, but eventually they become too wet and sticky themselves to be of any use. The crying eventually subsided and after half an hour she stepped outside, closing the door behind her. She said I could only be allowed back inside if I agreed to accept the flat. Barely able to muster a whisper, I made a final, weak attempt to stand up for myself. I told her that was blackmail. It was wrong. She said.
It doesn't matter. Nobody cares.
The tears started flowing again and I accepted. Only to have the rug yanked out from under me one last time. It was too late. The flat had been taken. I had screwed everything up. They had tried to help me, and I had screwed it up. I couldn't come back because I couldn't be helped. Nobody could help me. I was too sick. I needed to be locked up. That was the second incident to break me. Another piece of my psyche broke away and shattered on the steps beneath us, but with a different reaction. Not the silent numbing horror that had overtaken me before, it was quick and explosive. A stabbing pain engulfed my head, matched by another in my chest. I fell back against the railing, grabbed my head in my hands, and started shouting. Stop it! Stop it! Stop! My words vanishing into a long, high-pitched scream that blinded me. My eyes were wide open and flowing with tears, but I saw only whiteness. I began punching myself in the head repeatedly with my right hand. The world lost all form. My body lost all form. Past, present, and future lost all form. For those few moments existence as I knew it consisted of nothing more than that scream, a shrill, blood-curdling, eternal scream. To any passers-by walking to or from the pubs, takeaway restaurants, and shops that were within screaming distance, I looked like just another addict having a seizure on the steps of Passage House. It was a common occurrence, and a reasonable conclusion to draw. I had drawn the same conclusion myself when I witnessed similar episodes in the past. One of the residents would suffer a seizure while a member of staff looked impassively on, quietly waiting for the frenzy to end. It was Passage House, a temporary shelter for drug addicts. The whole community was accustomed to the bedlam. I was just another junkie, providing some temporary real-life entertainment for the locals. A horrific and unwilling theatrical performance with me as the star, great optics in favor of the poor long-suffering staff. The scream ended. My body and the surrounding world regained their corporeal forms. I leaned against the railing, heaving, shaking, docile and compliant, looking to her for help, my eyes pleading for even the smallest sign of sympathy. Silly me. She asked if I had learned my lesson. Yes. She said she didn't hear me and made me repeat it. She made me say it aloud in full. Yes. I have learned my lesson. She asked me if I was ready to admit I needed help. I agreed. She made me repeat that as well. Yes. I need help. I vaguely understood she was turning the screws but was too weak and too frightened to do anything about it. I was too shattered to do anything but agree.
Good.
She said. Her look softened. She even smiled. She told me I was lucky. She felt sorry for me. No one else did. I was lucky she was still trying to help me despite my fighting her all the time. She said it was bending the rules to allow me back in, but if I promised to accept the next flat she found, she would let me return. I agreed. She asked if there was anything I wanted to say to her, and I provided the answer she was looking for, hating both her and myself as the words left my lips. Thank you.